we need to be able to do something more than just be civil with each other. We've got to find a way to restore a human connection that can cross that divide. And that's why, to me, love is so important.
When ideas overlap with identities, then you can't have good faith disagreement because it's a rejection of the self.
X is like a trailer park in the hood.
You see Nick Fuentes, who is a neo-Nazi. Let's not pretend. I sometimes pull my punches. I don't want to get sued or something, but he's a neo-Nazi. I want to introduce my two guests. Thomas Chatterton Williams is, I'm just doing this from memory, Thomas, because we're friends. Professor at Bard College, that is right. New book, Summer of Our Discontent, which I just started reading. I'm not going to lie to you. And a columnist at The Atlantic. Come on up, Thomas. And John Wood is ambassador for Braver Angels and a columnist at USA Today, and he's the other guy on my left today. John, come on up. All right, this is obviously a free speech, free expression conference, and I do want to start with your book. What's the subtitle? Because it mentions in the subtitle something about free expression too, or discourse.
The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse.
Demise of Discourse. And I notice in the third sentence you get to the expression free expression. How is that relevant to the book? I mean, it starts in 2020, basically. I mean, it starts before that, but 2020 is that kind of hinge moment. What is the sort of general argument about the decline of discourse? Because if my memory serves, discourse has been declining for some time. Yeah. And I remember it being sort of in the toilet in like 2015, 16, 17. But what was it about that moment that was the hinge moment for you?
Well, that was the kind of peak of a trend that had been happening throughout the 2010s. And I go back to the Obama era. But the demise of discourse really is my attempt to try to get the reader to understand that I'm talking about the severe polarization that happens when you have two factions of the American society that both believe that they see all interactions through a lens of moral clarity, yeah, and that there's no way in which you can have a good faith disagreement on certain key topics. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, it's very difficult to talk about like the death of Charlie Kirk recently.
You didn't write about this recently, did you?
I did. I found a way to upset every part of the spectrum.
It's an incredible talent you have that I went onto Twitter and I was like, man, no one likes you today.
On the left or the right? On
the left and the right.
I united our society for a day on X and Blue Sky.
Yeah. John, how have you experienced this sort of kind of, civility in the discourse and this kind of declining sense? I mean, it's funny that I was reading something about Thomas's book a couple of days ago, and they mentioned something that I'd totally forgotten about, the Harper's letter. That you were a signatory. Well, I didn't sign it just because I wasn't asked. It wasn't because I hadn't.
You weren't asked?
No, can you believe that? I was deeply offended by this. Surprised. Camille, our mutual friend, was
Camille
asked.
Didn't ask you.
But this was a letter that was signed by Salman Rushdie. It was signed by Noam Chomsky, people on the right, people on the left. And that created like this tumult. I said, good Lord, what is so weird or offensive or aggravating to people about that just general plea for free speech? And it attacked people on both sides. It's the Trump side, left, right. This is a problem on both sides. I think it was at that moment that I realized that we were in a weird spot, that just this sort of banal thing that says, hey, free speech is good. I mean, what has your experience been in the sort of past decade of this stuff as a writer, as a sort of public person?
Well, I think that this gets to a little bit of the point that you're getting at, Thomas, with respect to the insistence on certainty. We do lack an aggregate sort of base level of intellectual humility as a virtue in our culture and in our discourse. But what the other side of that is, in part, is the fact that the moral and social and even political stakes of our disagreements seem to be so perilously high that we have normalized the idea that not even getting up to the point of compromise, but even dignifying dangerous differences in perspective is to risk the victory of a grand moral corruption that might undo whatever your version is of the authentic American project. And so there's an emotional tonality that has suffused our broader democracy that is in constant sort of catastrophe mode owing to this. And this phenomenon, I think, has crystallized in large part as a consequence of the fact that the identity makeup of the body politic has overlapped our basic political divisions so powerfully that to disagree with me is not just to disagree with an earnestly held intellectual position, it is to reject who I am as a human being, whether on the basis of my race, my sexuality, or my religion, or some other category. And so, while in this room, we tend to operate according to a pre-existing ethos of acknowledging the virtues of civility, the virtue of discourse, what has changed around us in this period of time is the stakes and the context in which discourse unfolds in a way that has flipped on its head the idea that discourse is intrinsically a virtue. We live in an age where it's pretty widely agreed upon, at least on the wings of our society, that it is not. And so that's where we find ourselves.
2020 is, it's an interesting time because the start of COVID and this enormous rupture in so many things. And, there's a long path to that. It doesn't start in 2020, but a lot of people feel it then. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, you've made people on the right mad, you've made people on the left mad. It's an incredible skill, and I appreciate that you do it. But one of the things I've noticed that's happening on the right that I find extremely disappointing, and I suppose I should have seen this coming, right? I should have actually had the kind of foresight, this is going to happen. But when you look at 2020, the way a lot of stuff happens on social media, in public, did you post the black square? Getting in trouble with people for not doing something, not something you did, but something you didn't do. And then you see the reaction to that now, and this is, I think, a hangover from that, which is people that have said to me in interviews, in private, that we don't care about principle. We care about revenge. This is what they did to us. And you want to play by their rules? They were beating us because they weren't playing by the rules, and you're a sucker for wanting to play by the rules. The number of people that have said that to me, whether it's Donald Trump's attacks on law firms, suing a network for an interview that he was not involved in, for editing it down, and was a totally fair edit, by the way. I've done a lot of edits of television interviews from an hour to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And no one seems to really care. The people that were the free speech warriors, supposedly, are nowhere to be found now because they're in charge and the tribe matters more. And to me, it seems with your book, 2020 is when everyone became deranged. The people that were both victimized by this, the victimizers, everyone in the end kind of went nuts. Is that a fair characterization? Do you think I'm being a little overwrought about what that kind of did to the brains of the people that were supposedly on our side about free speech?
No, I don't think you're. People like Christopher Rufo, who's become so prominent as a right-wing activist, guiding much of the Trump administration's approach to higher education and other things. He just came right out and wrote an article when Trump was reelected in City Journal, saying that, I used to be against cancel culture when the left was ascendant, but in fact, now that we're in power, this actually is a good tool to use, and we should use it, and we shouldn't stand on principle. He just wrote that in an essay.
You kind of have to admire it. It's he's not even pretending. He's just I'm telling you what I'm doing.
Most people still kind of pay tribute to virtue through hypocrisy, but he just said, actually, this is quite a useful thing. That's why I think terms like the woke right are actually helpful descriptors, because the illiberal extremes of both sides really share a kind of impulse to disavow liberal principles and norms of compromise and grace and negotiation, because they believe that everything is zero-sum. Politics is zero-sum. The culture war is zero-sum. And as you put so well, that any kind of victory my opponent has is a kind of a death of my own idea of what the authentic American society ought to be. This really makes discussion and discourse impossible. And you made also another very important point, which is that when ideas overlap with identities, then you can't have good faith disagreement, because it's a rejection of the self. I do really think that there's an authentic feeling that you also touch on so correctly. There's an authentic feeling that's been reverberating around the right for some time now, that they've really been mistreated, if not in government, in institutions that really matter, that our society esteems. You know, the universities, the entertainment industry, the publishing industry. And that
and there's some truth to that, by the way.
There is some truth to that, and that they feel that, as you put it, now is a time not for steadying the pendulum in the center, but for exacting a kind of revenge that will humiliate the side that they feel has denied them the recognition that we all do crave. So I think that to get a path forward, there's going to be some necessity in looking at the ways in which I think that the left enjoyed a kind of cultural dominance that really alienated so many people on the right. And even if they disagree with the authoritarianism that's creeping in our society, they think that this is somehow preferable to the kind of gaslighting and denial of the dominance that had preceded it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a surprising thing for me, because you presume that people on the right would think that markets are the solution to these things. And you take something like late night talk shows. The biggest late night talk show that nobody talks about is Greg Gutfeld's show on Fox News.
Right, I forgot that.
It beats all these other shows by a lot. I mean, the market, they're winning in that sense. And sure, it's not getting the coverage that Jimmy Kimmel and these people get on the New York Times. They have like columns every day of the jokes from last night. But yeah, I think we would be having a very different conversation if this were, 2 or 3 years ago. You have to, take aim at the people in power in some ways. But John, I think it was Nathan Glazer. Was it Nathan Glazer that wrote the book "We're All Multiculturalists Now"? At a certain point, I wonder, looking at so much stuff on the right, if we're all have embraced identity politics now, but just in sort of different ways.
Well, I think that yes, there is a degree to which we have wrapped our arms around the language of identity as the proper basis for formulating political allegiances and points of view. It's funny, we oftentimes look back in a somewhat romantic sort of way to the golden era of bipartisanship, which was sort of, mid-20th century America, the post-war economy, Richard Nixon and John Kennedy saying to each other in their first debate that this is a contest between people who disagree about the best way to serve our country, but this is not a disagreement as to whether or not we love our country. I'm roughly paraphrasing Richard Nixon. But just before and right after they had that interaction, Franklin Roosevelt, in his time, was complaining about the fact that the parties were so similar, that really you needed a liberal party, and that the Democratic Party had too many conservatives, and you had Barry Goldwater with the exact same opinion. The idea was that you wanted parties that would reflect, honestly, the real ideological differences in American society and their composition. Well, guess what? We got that. So, the grass is always greener on the other side, I suppose. But there's a deeper component to the identity issue that I want to bring up here, because I think that part of what we are really struggling with on a subterranean sort of way, when we look at the decline of the norms of civility, discourse, free speech, and so on and so forth, there can be a temptation to want to sort of revive that by just sort of reminding people how important that is as a norm. But I think the reason we're in not just an identity moment, but a populist moment, to draw a thread of connection between these two on each side, is that you have people who have been, whether you're thinking about it in terms of sort of, the base of the MAGA coalition, white working class, typically, culturally Christian and conservative, but not necessarily high Christian, highly educated sort of folks on the one hand, or people from the inner cities, people who consider themselves to be a part of a coalition of marginalized groups. These are people who did not feel themselves to be represented in an authentic way within the mainstream of American political society in terms of either its norms or the genuine political representation that existed at the time, even in the golden era of bipartisanship. In other words, Barry Goldwater represented a vast constituency of Americans who felt that Walter Cronkite was against them, who felt that the establishments of the Democratic and the Republican parties were against them. And I don't have to say anything to anybody in this room about the degree to which African Americans and certainly people of a more sort of left-wing political disposition felt themselves alienated, whether in racial terms or vis-a-vis sort of the sledgehammer of McCarthyism and the anti-sort of socialist consensus that existed in the two parties. I don't have to emphasize how much they felt marginalized even back then. So what we are witnessing now in the sort of two-pronged sort of counterattack on our norms is the concomitant two-pronged sort of counterattack against the traditional liberal center of American society, what had traditionally been the mainstream Republican and Democratic agreement on liberal sort of principles by folks who, on the one hand, oftentimes have a racial and ethnic and subgroup sort of identity base, and on the other hand, are coming from a more traditionally sort of, we're using the term Christian nationalism as a shorthand for it, but an idea of what America is that is steeped in that sort of story. And so we need to be able to do something more than just be civil with each other. We've got to find a way to restore a human connection that can cross that divide. And that's why, to me, love is so important. Goodwill is so important. The transcendent philosophy of nonviolence that Martin Luther King Jr. stood on. That's why that's so important to me, because civility that is just a mere politeness as opposed to a civility rooted in a transcendent goodwill for humanity will not break the identity barrier. And we will just analyze ourselves to death trying to imagine how it could be otherwise if we don't go a level deeper in these sorts of conversations.
Thomas, 2020 was the racial reckoning. That happened. I don't even know if there was a racial reckoning. We talked about a lot of things, but I noticed with people in the kind of MAGA coalition, and I covered so many Donald Trump rallies that there's probably pictures of me. You probably think I was like working for Trump. I was there covering a lot of rallies, and I remember this thing that used to come up all the time when I talked to people and asked them why they were there, what was motivating them, and I would inevitably get around to this comment, which I didn't believe was actually true, but was a feeling that people had when you would hear the expression, I'm sure you've heard it too, people say, I was really tired of being called a racist, right? You've heard that. And I guarantee you that this person is not interacting with enough people and having sort of talking about, race politics that someone's calling them, but that was kind of the feeling in the culture, right? In the sort of MAGA, this kind of disaffected populist movement, I constantly heard that. And I'm not overstating how much people would say something like this to me. Trump said in 2016, he said PC all the time, that's an acronym that's gone. It was replaced by wokeness and the rest of it. But there was that feeling. And then 2020 happened. And it seemed to have, for a lot of people that I knew, the opposite effect as it was intending to have, because it came with like blunt force. There wasn't a lot of persuasion in that. And that's a lot of what your book is about. And the racial politics of it now, and you've written, a couple of books about this. What do you make of where we are today? Because obviously, Hispanic men in particular really took a big, and I was visiting with a lot of people in Texas and Tejanos that were really trending towards Trump. The trend amongst black men wasn't enormous, but there was a noticeable trend. Where are we do you think, in just kind of that broader sense of compared to where we were in 2020?
I mean, that's such an important point to highlight and an astute question. It's really important to think through the ways in which the definition of racism in the 2010s, let's say starting in 2012, around when Trayvon Martin was so tragically killed in Sanford, Florida, Black Lives Matter starts in earnest, then the death of Michael Brown and this kind of, this slew of killings of mostly unarmed black men, one child, Tamir Rice, some women too, that go viral, that are videotaped and are distributed through social networks that are new and that are organizing our kind of political views. And this starts to also distribute a kind of way of speaking about race that might have made sense at a time in the academy and has been around for a long time. Critical race theory and other ways of talking about race and identity that were a kind of jargon that then became mainstreamed and just bandied about. And the layperson can't really deal with the kind of layers of structural racism that were being thrust upon Americans in this time period. I really think that the left, probably well-meaning in most cases, so effectively overplayed its hand that we now are in an era of outright racism and vice signaling as opposed to virtue signaling, where people got such fatigue at policing their thoughts and speech and trying to perform a kind of morality that always recognized that things as abstruse as punctuality were in fact a system of white supremacy, because that's an Anglo-Saxon capitalist kind of use of time that Native peoples don't operate in except through colonial interventions. Yeah. This was something that was actually, it sounds absurd, but it was mainstream to the point that there were lists distributed throughout New York City public schools of how white supremacy culture operates, reverence for the written word, and all kinds of things that I think made people exhausted. And I think
that one was especially crazy.
Yeah.
And it was I don't know if that was like formalized by some central committee of idiots, but it came out and I saw it in various places, like the written word, hard work.
Yeah, this list.
It was the single most racist document I had seen in a very long time. Yeah.
Yeah, an out-and-out racist would agree with all of these kinds of points. But this was also the time in which in 2020, at the peak of this kind of madness, you had these extraordinary images of like a group of white people, all masked, screaming at a table of two white diners for not being with them and protesting against violence against black lives, and essentially calling them racist.
As I did, and you can see videos of this too, of the same thing, but the people on the other end of the screaming are black cops. In New York City, which is a majority minority police.
You see many kind of absurd images like this. It just went to an extent at which I think that it became whatever was gained in the short term when you beat everybody into submission to display a black square after George Floyd died. It was a Pyrrhic victory that has now made it kind of appealing to be racist, to actually say things that had been banished from the kind of reputable public discourse for a long time. Now that's come back online with a vengeance. It's come back into our politics. But the irony, as you also mentioned, is that it's too easy to say that Donald Trump simply represents, a kind of racist politics that has always been in America. He in fact, enjoyed the least polarized, racially polarized electoral victory since Richard Nixon. That has to be grappled with, how there are other factors, and everything was reduced to a lens of race that obfuscated what is actually going on in our society, which I think is more a kind of rejection of elite manners and etiquette and a status quo that was alienating to people regardless of ancestry and ethnicity.
Michael, can I just jump right on a thread in that fabric? Because Thomas, I think one of the things I heard you say there is that this most recent wave of anti-racism was sort of foisting this complex ideological doctrine in a way that sort of wielded it as just an undigestible sort of forced meal on people in the
Forced meal is good, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? And I completely agree with that. And I also agree with the important point that Donald Trump's coalition, it is a coalition. There are people in that coalition who are, racist, and they come from, lines of the American experience that have, been prejudiced. But then there are a lot of people who you never would have thought of racist as being racist in conventional terms, who just don't like being called racist, and that has a radicalizing effect. But that gets to my biggest criticism of the mainstream of the anti-racist movement, the mainstream sort of much of what you saw out of Black Lives Matter, as well as my great concern for the direction that the right may be going in now. And that's this, and to just focus it in on the social justice side of the equation, and to bring it back to Dr. King, the walking away from the ethos of the beloved community, the walking away from a vision both of freedom of speech and democratic activism, which seeks justice and progress, while simultaneously trying to create a culture for us to actually live with respect and even embrace each other as neighbors and members in a community, right? Abraham Lincoln was an extraordinary example as a politician because he was able to say simultaneously that slavery is an evil, but most people who support slavery are good people who haven't caught up with the moral contradiction of the thing that they believe in. Dr. King believed in loving the enemy, loving your opponent. And he said to those who followed him that we do not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent. We do not seek to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and his understanding so that we may be reconciled to each other in the beloved community, and that it is important for us to tell those who oppose us that we seek to achieve truth and justice, not just for ourselves and our children, but for them and their children as well. And so you saw on the right the real clear demarcation line between that traditional moral ethos, between that Christ-like golden rule conviction, and something very different at Charlie Kirk's memorial, when Erica Kirk stood up and said that she forgave the man who killed him, and Donald Trump got up and said, see, that's the difference between me and Charlie. I hate my enemies, right? And he said it, he said it in his, stand-up comic kind of way, but I also took him fairly seriously because that is the line that runs through every human heart. Yeah. In addition to down the middle of our politics.
We don't have much time left, but I want to put something to you that a friend of mine, very smart guy, we talk about speech issues all the time, put to me. And he said, look, Michael, we believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant, but it hasn't been. This was his argument to me, is that if you look on X, you see Nick Fuentes, who is a neo-Nazi. And let's not pretend. I sometimes pull my punches. I don't want to get sued or something, but he's a neo-Nazi. Holocaust denial is, minimization, kind of bordering on denial, is creeping back into the conversation. We've had actual, real conversations amongst people who have millions and millions of followers, whether Winston Churchill was the good guy or the bad guy in World War II. I hate to tell you guys, but he was the good guy. And if you think otherwise, but there are a lot of people who do. And so we opened that up. We took all the moderation away. Everyone out there, and this was a very challenging conversation that I had with him, and we batted this back and forth for a while. And I know that we don't have any time. It's the worst question to ask with 3 minutes left. But what do you think about this? We've opened up the floodgates, and there's just a lot of bad actors, and they're becoming really popular.
Well, I think social media is really a toxin, and I think that private companies create communities with kind of fair and transparent moderation, but they have to be moderated. An absolute free-for-all becomes kind of babble where everybody's just screaming and no sense can be made of what's being articulated. Twitter had tons of problems before Elon Musk bought it, but it had a kind of moderation that was preferable to what is happening now and what has allowed so much Holocaust denial and other forms of extraordinary racism to flourish. I think that, that isn't inconsistent with a view of the First Amendment, that it can be, easily articulated as the government should never be able to restrict your speech. And, it's more alarming to hear Pam Bondi or the Attorney General or whatever say that you can be arrested for hate speech than it is to have racists screaming on Twitter. But I think private social media platforms really do have to be moderated, and we've seen what happens when they're not.
And I will say that, this, I didn't tell you my opinions on this, and I won't about that in that conversation, but to point out that Holocaust denial is illegal throughout Europe and has done almost nothing to stop Holocaust denial in Europe. Some of the biggest Holocaust deniers are people that are based in Europe. But John, you have a 1 minute thought on that?
Yeah. I had such high hopes for Twitter when Elon Musk bought it, and the reality of things is so far in the other direction. I mean, I would say that X as we know it is like, it's like, Twitter under Jack Dorsey and previously, it was like an HOA with really annoying policies and management, people being your business, right? It was annoying. There's a lot of things you didn't like, but X is like a trailer park in the hood. And so it's the neighborhood is really, I almost miss the HOAs sometimes, but this just goes to the deeper, point. Free speech is necessary, but insufficient. Free speech without virtue is not enough. And at some point, the conversation has to move back to grace. At some point, the conversation has to return to forgiveness. At some point, the conversation, even while adamantly insisting upon the norms of free speech, has to come back to the transcendent and eternal truth of love. Because without that, we have nothing.